This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome to today's Digital History Seminar. We're going to be recording and live streaming the seminar. So firstly, when it comes to the questions, if you could speak up, that would be great. Secondly, if there's anything that you don't want to have recorded, please either don't say it or ask us to edit it out at the end. The other thing I wanted to say is that we'll be going to the University Arms on Store Street afterwards to carry on the conversation, and everybody's welcome to join us there. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome Mia Ridge, who is a research fellow at Trinity College Dublin. She's going to be talking today about a critical examination of citizen history projects. So I'd like to welcome Mia to talk about citizen history and its discontents.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to present today. So in this paper I will briefly define crowdsourcing and citizen history. I'll introduce some key examples that should show you the potential of crowdsourcing or citizen history for encouraging new historians and for engaging the public in the process of creating history or making history. I'll review current models for citizen history projects, look at the role of expert participants in community discussion, look at the social construction of knowledge that happens online, and how this turns crowdsourcing into citizen history. I'll consider some of the structural reasons why some projects with aspirations to citizen history really only manage to be crowdsourcing projects. They don't quite hit the heights they'd like to. And I'll conclude by considering the impact of this conflation of crowdsourcing and citizen history, and asking which historical skills should be considered a core part of the citizen historian experience. Some of this comes out of my PhD research, where I was comparing academic with non-academic historians, specifically family and local historians. And as a result, I became interested in how digital platforms, digital resources have affected how people become historians through processes outside of formal academic training, and sometimes in conjunction with formal academic training too. More broadly, I'm interested in the impact of digitality on the practices of historical research. As part of my PhD research, there's obviously a lot more that I couldn't present here, and I'm also walking a tightrope in a very digital history, digital humanities way, between revealing enough to be interesting and yet not giving away so much that if someone watching on YouTube published the whole thing and I wouldn't lose out. I have a background in human-computer interaction research, so I've used methods like trace ethnography, which is the analysis of documentary traces that result from computer-mediated communication, including project documentation, interfaces, forum posts, and social media. And hopefully you'll immediately see that there are parallels with the kinds of sources that historians use. These are just much more contemporary. And I've been looking at the interactions between crowdsourcing participants and stakeholders online. I've analysed a lot of history and science-based crowdsourcing projects in terms of their affordances, which are really the actions they appear to enable and those they discourage. One thing I'd like to make clear, having worked on large partnership projects in museums, that if I'm acting as a critical friend, I'm also doing so in a sense that is very sympathetic to the reality of implementing projects. I know that there are millions of reasons why projects might not be able to live up to all the promises that they've made. They might have to prioritise internal concerns over certain types of public engagement. That's the reality that happens. So rather than casting blame, I'm more interested in the effect of and the structural reasons why some participatory projects don't support all of their stated goals. So some definitions first. Crowdsourcing was originally defined back in 2006 in relation to outsourcing. It's the act of putting out a call for people to take on work once done within an organisation. So unlike outsourcing, the call is open to the crowd, so participants' skills and motivations might not be known to the organisation that's using them. In reality, particularly in heritage crowdsourcing, it's rarely actually a crowd, but any call for participation is heeded by only a small group, those who have the relevant skills, the interests, the leisure time, the devices to take part. So there are many barriers to participation. Crowdsourcing is currently popular with cultural heritage institutions. It's helped digitise and enhance millions, probably billions of catalogue records and primary documents. Ideally, in cultural heritage crowdsourcing, the public undertake meaningful tasks in an environment with inherently rewarding activities or goals, we can't pay people to take part, and we have a sort of an ethical responsibility to make sure that they're actually gaining as much from participation as the institution is. Crowdsourcing in heritage and history appeals to altruistic motivations to make a difference in the world, to intrinsic motivations, people just love spending time working on historical material. It offers a chance to follow personal interests, to gain behind-the-scenes access to museums, libraries, archives, to meet academics and work with them, and offers opportunities for close encounters with historical material. But basically, it's a process of transforming input content into output content. The complexity of the task varies hugely, as does the level of involvement. So it could be simple contributions through crowdsourced observation, transcription, categorization, right through to independent research on set questions, or even collaboratively defining research questions, running outreach to the public, writing out materials. A related field is citizen science, which partly has its roots in public participation in science research, so environmental monitoring, things like that. But projects from the Universe group, which is one of the leading groups that are putting out citizen science projects, have also drawn on the crowdsourcing model of distributed tasks. Definitions of crowdsourcing fall into two camps, and this is a pattern we'll see repeated in citizen history. In its simplest form, citizen science is indistinguishable from crowdsourcing. People are assisting scientists with data processing tasks, like categorizing images, using the sort of the human capacity to recognize patterns. But in more sort of advanced definitions, we've got projects that include participants in data analysis and research design, people taking on independent research projects, people taking the data generated through projects and using it to run their own research. Projects like Zooniverse sort of began as crowdsourcing and then realised the potential of for citizen scientists to develop when they gave access to the materials. So self-selecting participants could go further than simply transcribing or classifying images. The long history in citizen science means there's a body of research that I've been able to draw on for comparisons to citizen history. And one of the useful models that's come from public participation in science research categorises projects as contributory, collaborative or co-creative, based on the tasks that participants are involved in and how much control they have over the different stages. So many crowdsourcing projects are contributory. The stakeholders set up the project and you just transcribe text for them. But some of them are starting to edge into more collaborative projects, and that's where we see things that are closer to citizen science or citizen history because they require deeper skills and they're a chance to practice more skills. But I'm not sure that there's a direct sort of correlative or causal link between these things. It might just be a correlation. And another model that for me has resonances with citizen history, and I don't think it does for everyone, is the long practice of history in avocational history. And I prefer that term to amateur history because I think a lot of people who practice history in their spare time were trained in history but don't work as historians. And obviously the academic job market means there's not room for everyone who's done undergraduate or even postgraduate training in history. So there's a lot of people who are continuing their interest in history, but they're happily having a very enjoyable day job as well. So we see people like local historians, family historians, and I think local historians in the UK sometimes undertake really complex collaborative projects. And I think this partly is the influence of the Oxford University and Open University distance education course in local history. It includes things like database design as part of the basic training. So these people are equipped with enough skills to go and do basic collaborative projects. And I think it's also helped seed some of these communities of practice for local history groups because people know that other people they're working with have got the same training, they've got the same approach to the practices of history. So some of these avocational historians have had undergraduate academic training, others have learnt their skills entirely through practice. In my interviews I've talked to people who have up to 40 years experience as family historians. They're extremely experienced historians. And these avocational historians often participate in communities of practice. Sometimes they're discussion online, and obviously a lot of them are in person, particularly for local history groups. But you see family historians negotiating their family histories with other researchers working on the same families, and with family members They're interpreting their history for people who don't necessarily want to do the research themselves. So the richness, the variety, and the depth of these discussions can be really interesting. And I don't think these communities are perfect, but I think these communities of practice who meet in local village halls or they meet in small online communities, they've set the standard to which I'm comparing citizen history projects, because I think some of them are so good and they're such wonderful examples of the practices of history that some of the citizen history projects sort of can pale in comparison. When I talk about communities of practice, it has a very specific meaning. It's a social learning system where newcomers can learn and acquire knowledge through participation in everyday activity with colleagues. It comes out of work on situated learning, which in turn was looking at things like apprenticeship systems. So for historians who traditionally had sort of PhDs that were apprenticeships in the practices of being a historian, I think there's a lot of similarities with tailors learning to the trade of being a tailor by spending time doing the ironing and setting up smaller parts of the practice. So online forums support many of the activities typical of communities of practice. Problem solving, making and answering requests for information, coordinating activities, undertaking documentation projects. These are all things that you see as people learn to be whatever discipline it is they're moving into. The work they're conducting might itself be solitary, as is traditional for historical research, but communities of practice through their discourse develop a shared repertoire of resources. They've shared experiences, stories, tools. They've got ways of addressing recurring problems that they can apply to new problems. While the original theoretical work on communities of practice was about in-person discussion and in-person encounters, online communications similarly show the traces of these development of shared practices. And because they're online, they're written, they're searchable, they're discoverable by others, so they form a pattern. And for some of these online communities that have been going for a really long time, you've got over 20 years worth of discussion and discourse. So you can go back and look at things like, mostly they're on Ancestry now, but all the earlier family history forums and the way that people were learning to be historians through those early conversations. So these online conversations are an example of what could be called legitimate peripheral participation, which is a process by where newcomers start off with engaging in simple practices. So you might lurk on a forum before you start to post your first question. But then you gradually get involved in levels of participation that make you a legitimate but peripheral member of the community. So you might be a transcriber starting out with a really basic sort of level of participation in a project, but the fact that there's a forum means that you can watch how other people are talking about the documents. So you're getting a sense of what they think of the documents, that there are different ways of thinking about the same documents, that not all documents are equal, not all sources are equal. So you're starting to learn some of the practices of being a historian. It's this opportunity to observe more experienced members of the community as they're sharing their knowledge through discourse that is particularly important. Because a lot of knowledge that historians learn is tacit, it's really hard to elicit, but in explaining to someone else, you're forced to articulate those forms of tacit knowledge. So it helps people go from being an outsider through to being an insider, sort of passing through these stages of level of engagement and level of knowledge about these communities of practice. And you can see this learning on things like family history or genealogy sites, where someone might post a simple request for help. I saw one the other day. My grandfather apparently worked in a circus. Where would I find records about someone who worked in a circus? And they were pointed to a range of resources, circus histories, international circus histories, because they might not have realised that circuses would travel across continental Europe. The people who were posting went away and read up more on circus history so that they could help this person answer their query. So the process of engaging in that kind of conversation teaches everyone more skills and gives everyone a chance to deepen their historical practices. My analysis of these online communities has been informed by interviews with family and local historians, and they act as a useful reminder that discussion online is only a part of the discussion that happens. So there's a lot of personal correspondence, direct correspondence via email. Events and meetings are also particularly important. You get a lot more conversation conducted more easily and with more sort of empathy and understanding in person than you get online. I think it's also important to note that these online discussions only ever represent those enough who are confident enough to post. So you might get a large percentage of people who are learning by reading but not by posting. They also favour the articulate, and they favour those with leisure time to read and to post. So, you know, in history we should always be thinking about who's not represented, and I think that's one thing to think about with online communications. One thing that's interesting to note is that many of these sort of educational history projects and communities of practice are based around particular regions. So they might be based around the parishes of Cornwall, they might be based around particular boroughs in London, particular types of local connections. So there's something about that specificity of experience. They're also based a lot on either shared approaches, so family historians, or interest in particular topics. You could probably find a forum somewhere discussing almost any historical topic or type of object that you can think of. It really, the internet goes deep on these kinds of things. So to think about what historians actually are and how to know when you are a historian and when someone is a citizen historian, you need to think about what a historian actually is. And it's quite difficult to define. Lamillianova says that the discipline of history is a set of practices rather than beliefs or theories. This lack of a formal definition makes it quite difficult to assess claims about when is someone a citizen historian. And I think it echoes earlier issues with the reception of family historians and genealogists and local historians by archivists and professional historians. As a sort of publicly available source and one that's quite influential in the States, I turn to the American Historical Association's core competencies for students in history courses and degree programs. So they talk about the ability to engage in historical inquiry, to practice historical empathy, to understand the complex nature of the historical record, to practice historical thinking. So Yordanova posits three inseparable groups of skills: the technical, so paleography, skills related to the finding and evaluating of sources, to investigate a specific historical problem once you've identified something you want to follow up, and interpretive skills. And I think then if history is about what historians do, crowdsourcing offers excellent opportunities to observe what historians do, to learn technical skills and to practice technical skills like paleography. You can gain some familiarity with sources. It doesn't necessarily help you gain those interpretive and sort of really solid source-based skills. It might require more support or activities outside the project. Historical thinking is another useful concept. It's not necessarily always very well defined. So I'm using this definition, which talks about things like observation, so just looking at a document and taking in the details of that document. Thinking about who made a document, why they made a document, making inferences, guessing about meaning, using evidence well when you're making an argument, which also presupposes that you want to make an argument, which people might not explicitly realise they're doing, even though we are generally always making an argument when we're using a source. Posing questions, keeping track of the questions that you're asking, and reminding yourself to be constantly questioning every source that you come across. And using corroboration to kind of compare the documents that you're looking at with what you know from other documents and from the wider historiography. So we'll see things like forum posts showing people looking at other sources to check names. So they're not just transcribing, they're looking at other sources, they're getting a sense of whether the original source has made a mistake, and how they should deal with that sort of slightly interpretive act, or do you record the original name, or do you go with the name that you know to be correct? It might be a place name or someone's name. But even these kind of really mechanical tasks like transcribing can provide hooks for more in-depth historical work. But again, we're not seeing that people are necessarily making explicit historiographical arguments in narrative form as a result of crowdsourcing. So some examples. I'm currently working on a World War I project, so some of the examples I look at are World War I projects. There's a huge, massive range to look at online. So these sort of citizen projects or participatory history projects include tasks like type what you see transcriptions, which can vary in difficulty depending on the handwriting and the state of the document, but it's generally not a very subjective task. through the complex research and interpretive tasks. Free BMD began in 1998, and I assume most people here have come across it or used it at some point if you work on British history. They aim to provide free internet access to the indexes of births, deaths and marriages from the civil records. 10 years later they had 200 million records. It's a grassroots, self-organised project, and these kind of go beyond co-creative projects because any involvement from official organisation comes at the behest of the group. They entirely control what happens. They're not necessarily undertaking research tasks. Clearly they're getting very familiar with sources, although they are indexes, not the original sources. But they're making huge contributions to public knowledge through their work. There are a great many forums on World War I, and many of them are large, long-term communities of practice, immense amounts of resources created. Like people will make wikis, they'll make guides, they'll produce publications. I haven't felt that it's fair to single out individual posters on these forums, so I haven't highlighted individual conversations. But looking at these forums has informed my analysis about the depths of expertise and the kinds of learning possible through participation. They're not crowdsourcing in that they don't work to transform source material, but they're large communities of practice, and experts can help novices gain the kinds of skills they need to make better historical choices. So I think it's a form of citizen history, but not a form of crowdsourcing. And on to something that is crowdsourcing. Old Weather is a Zooniverse project. They aim to extract weather information from historic ship's logs. It was designed for use by climate scientists who wanted to fill gaps in the historical record of temperatures over time. It launched back in 2010. It's a structured transcription project, so you transcribe certain fields, certain parts of information from the original ship's logs into a database that underlies the system. These structured transcription projects have been used on things as diverse as playbills, restaurant menus, censuses, obviously other biographical records. They can be really productive. They sometimes run out of material because they have such high levels of participation. But perhaps more importantly, for thinking about how people might become historians or be interested in history, there's something about these close encounters with the original, often handwritten documents that seems to be an opportunity to awaken curiosity about the stories behind the documents. In turn, that curiosity is linked to motivation to learn more about the sources and to learn new skills to help answer some of those questions that have arisen. So this was originally intended as a purely citizen science project. Forums, the Zooniverse projects tend to have forums because they help answer the large numbers of questions that you get at the start of a new project. But these have become almost canonical examples of the roles of forums in supporting informal learning experiences. And because these logs contain sort of lots of interesting details, people would go to the forums to post about things that they'd seen. It might be a ship had sighted another ship, it might have been an interesting death at sea, it might have been like the discovery of an island sometimes, people seeing auroras. There's all kinds of things that people would see in the logs and just note them as being interesting. So they'd go to the forum and say, oh, this is interesting. People on the Old Weather forums also put together guides to specific ships. So this is a guide to the handwriting of the specific keeper of the log from one ship. They're showing different examples here of how he writes T's or Y's. And it's really detailed contextual information about when you're transcribing logs from this ship. These are the acronyms they use, these are the abbreviations. And these have been compiled over time by other transcribers. But participants in these forums have actually gone further. They've written compendiums of maritime information, of weather information. They've worked with maritime historians to write ships' histories based on the logs. They also noticed things like what looked like possible outbreaks of the Spanish flu on ships in 1918 and started compiling lists of ships with where the sick lists were, the numbers of people sick were greater than usual. They looked at where they'd been, where they were travelling to, and started to relate that to the wider history that was known about the Spanish flu. So there are some really lovely examples of participants discovering or rediscovering a latent interest in history and going on to conduct historical research. But I think in some ways, Old Weather is a grassroots historical project that just happens to be on a crowdsourcing platform. There's something about the inherent interestingness of those historical documents that drew people in, but I think this success is quite hard to replicate. And so, Operation War Diary is another Zooniverse project, clearly informed by their earlier experience with Old Weather. It was created in conjunction with the Imperial War Museum and the National Archives. Again, it's a structured transcription project. The aim is to extract metadata from British military unit war diaries, specifically on the Western Front. It launched in January this year, 2014. They use the term citizen historians a lot, so you can see down here they're working with citizen historians. The term occurs a lot in the communication around the project. And as in Old Weather, we see participants using other sites to cross-check names. So people will use things like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission site to check the names of officers. As unit diaries, you generally only get the names of officers. You see experts answering questions. But we also see that lots of interesting questions are being sort of raised and not necessarily picked up sometimes. So on the left is one of the original pages from the unit diary, and two different transcribers have noted that the men reported to their NCO that they had been asked if they wanted to settle in this French village post-war. And he said not one of them was interested in the offer. So two different transcribers, because 5 transcribers look at each page, noted this encounter, and they're kind of like, well, that's interesting, I wonder what the story behind that is. One of the moderators has taken this and made it into a post, so you can comment both on the original object and you can explicitly create a forum post. But there's been no response, so no one has kind of picked up this opportunity to explain why the French villagers might have offered this or why the men might have said no. And it speaks to the absence of experts who could answer this question or who could provide pointers to the related discussions. And I think this absence of experts throws an inherent tension in this project into relief. So the project is about creating material for use in the Lives of the First World War project, for the use of academics and for the National Archives. They talk about citizen historians a lot, but nowhere do they have a stated explicit aim to support those citizen historians, which in the way of things means that if it's not stated as an aim, if it's not a deliverable, then it's not going to be allocated resources, which might go some way to explain the absence of expert voices in that forum. They did invite academic historians to take part on their board, but again, the way that this has been done can create unintentional problems. Now that's almost difficult to see, but it's a forum discussion, so there's a range of people posting. We have, someone's username here. These people up here are moderators. They're often other participants who've been given the power to delete spam posts and to make sure that things keep running smoothly. But we also see here that there are some people who are labelled historians. So there's 2 different people who are on the academic board labelled historian, which raises the question, what then are these citizen historians? If they don't deserve the label historian, if someone else is granted this label, then it creates a big question about how other participants are regarded. I think the spectre of the faux historian is started to raise at this point. I think they've also had trouble managing participant expectations, and I think again it's partly because of the success of other projects like Old Weather. Because crowdsourcing participants will often look at other projects, their expectations will be set by what they know is happening in other projects. So this post is really encouraging people not to wait for academic historians to come in and grant them all their wishes and give them the answers. Help each other, help yourselves. But I think it contradicts the spirit of the Zooniverse projects, which on the application form, if you want to do a project with them, will prompt you. Are there members of your team willing to write blog posts, join forum discussions, and otherwise take part in outreach? So they have very explicit expectations about the resources that an institution will put into these projects. Of course, in reality, it's really hard to do this, and there are many reasons for this. So moving on, the Children of the Lot's Ghetto project was intentionally designed as a crowdsourcing citizen history project to encourage historical thinking and the development of skills. They're explicitly following on from the model of citizen science projects in that vein of public participation in science research. They began using the term citizen history in 2011. They conceived of this project as an experiment in finding out what happens if we trust visitors with the research work of the museum. So my previous examples were based on micro-tasks. These are sort of small, discrete tasks like transcribing sections of text, where the interest that developed in history was a side effect of exposure to historical records and participation in a community of interest. In contrast, this project goes beyond the type what you see model and asks people to help them undertake research tasks. These research tasks require navigating through multilingual archives. So some of the records are in Polish. Some people who, it's based on children who signed a book in the ghetto, and it's trying to find out what happened to them did they survive the Holocaust, or what was their history after that. So sometimes if they've ended up in America, their names have been transliterated perhaps through more than one language. So they're really complex tasks dealing with transliteration, uncertainty about variation in names. When these kids signed the book, they'll often have signed like their family nickname or the name that they're called by in the playground and not the name on the birth certificate. So participants are prompted to make subjective and difficult decisions about the relevance of historical materials in databases officially supplied by the project, and to reflect on their decision-making process in saying, I think this child's signature here is actually this person here who was at this school here, and who made it to America and died in 1974. It's requiring participants to develop source-based skills to link evidence to arguments. It's really encouraging them to be historians. So they've broken the process down, they've scaffolded the process by developing an interface and a workflow that breaks it down into smaller tasks. They also provide, so they've got really specific prompts about how do you take a great big task like finding a child's name signed here, finding them in databases. So they've given you prompts around birth dates, addresses, first names, last names, to help you break that down into the process of formulating queries for databases and formulating questions. You also get personal feedback on specific tasks by the community manager, who's responsible for checking records for accuracy, and also for encouraging people to move through the process as they learn what's required for each stage. She describes it as the process of moving from a question to a data point to a narrative. So they're really encouraging people to move on to that interpretive stage of history. You can see the level of patience required to convey and to convince newcomers to act on the project's concern for accuracy. Some students really have trouble sort of appreciating that the Holocaust is a particularly sensitive issue, and that people's lives, you can't just sort of mistake one John Smith for another. It does matter if you get their names right. But you also see people being challenged to practice and reflect on the historical process and the research skills that they're learning. I think this is the pinnacle of institutionally led citizen history, but it's incredibly resource intensive. It's difficult to scale up to the thousands of participants that you see in other research projects or other crowdsourcing projects. So thinking about the lessons from these case studies, it's evident that exposure to historical material is powerful. Arlette Farge calls the exact recopying of words an exclusive and privileged way of entering into the world of a document. There's something about that active, intimate encounter with documents that encourages people to engage with them beyond the crowdsourcing task of transcribing what they're seeing. Clearly, providing online space for discussions is important, as is attracting and retaining a critical mass of participants. Participants benefit from translating their experiences into conversation. They can learn more skills by observing those with expertise. Online discussion allows people to notice interesting content, to look for and collect other examples, and to discuss patterns or connections. So all skills that are relevant to the processes of history and that in some ways are similar to the process of reading in an archive. So in my abstract I asked whether citizen history projects can succeed without communities of experts and peers to nurture those sparks of historical curiosity. And I think if you assume a definition of success for citizen history projects that includes supporting novice historians in learning the skills of a discipline, and I don't think that's a given, then the silences on the Operation War Diary suggest that you do need that expert participation, or you do need people who are slightly further ahead than you in that process of learning historical skills to help you through the process. And I really don't want to denigrate the value of particular forum posts and anyone contributing in that conversation. But I think that novices in conversation with each other aren't able to engage in situated learning. At least not to the extent they would be if they were able to observe experts at work and in conversation. If you taught undergraduates, you might have a sense of how this works. So expertise can be gained through discussion, and you see participants clearly building up a really strong sense of what's typical in the source documents when they've seen something unusual. But you need those experts to provide models to emulate and to see the community with shared examples and patterns of historical thinking. So forums like Old Weather have a really long history of people discussing things and interpreting things and how working out what's normal and what's an anomaly and what might be interesting and what's just something odd that's gone with the sources. But if you don't have that history of conversation, then it's difficult to find patterns to look back on. And these experts by no means need to be academic historians or professional historians. You see posters without official affiliations clearly demonstrating expertise and a lot of historical knowledge. But participation in the forum seems to have dwindled slowly since launch. And I suspect it's partly because there's a lot of worldwide activity on the internet. There are a lot of really strongly identified forums with strong histories, and participants have a strong sense of loyalty and strong ties to them, strong ties to other participants. I think museums can underestimate the importance of those bonds and those loyalties, and the sort of, it's a bit like walking into a local pub and saying, it's really great that you're having this conversation here, but why don't we continue it in my office? It's like, why would we do that? We're really comfortable in the pub. So if a project fails to attract or supply experts in some way who are willing to engage in that discussion, then it's not going to create an effective learning environment for citizen historians. And you see this with some of the citizen science projects in the Zooniverse galaxy of projects, where participants explicitly request the expert participation they see on other projects. So the Galaxy Zoo project, which is the first ever Zooniverse project about identifying or categorizing images of galaxies, had a lot of serendipitous discoveries quite early on where scientists would go, actually that's really interesting, and forum participants would collect examples of it, and it was a beautiful kind of synergy. As they launched more and more projects, and the scientists were busy doing things like writing grants and publishing papers and teaching, less attention was being paid to the forum. So some of the people who were left on the forum got together and kind of made a case. They said that there's serendipitous discoveries are still probably happening, but it takes a professional astronomer to read those posts containing the discoveries to recognize when something is really odd, really cool, really interesting. And I think this post echo statements from staff involved in Old Weather back when it sort of originally began and had a very strong oversight from the National Maritime Museum as it was then. And staff there said that professional researchers should be involved in community discussion because they can set specific challenges, they can give feedback, and they can respond to the questions and interests that come from the community themselves. So you need experts to provide a level of scaffolding around that experience. I think there's also something about the agency of participants in these institutionally controlled projects. When you look at the grassroots groups, they have an advantage in some ways because they created the space. They set the rules, they set the goals for the project. There's no invisible authority figure lurking in the background anyway. Where when you have these proper historians who could be the ones who make these sort of authoritative statements, I think that might have a quelling or a dampening effect because participants are dutifully deferring their speculation until the expert comes in and tells them what they should think. And some of the discourse operates in interesting ways. So people will join the project, or a new batch of diaries will come in from a new kind of unit. So you'll see participants suggesting new hashtags, which operate almost as a form of taxonomy or a vocabulary that you can generate on the fly. But then you get these well-intentioned responses from volunteer moderators saying things like, well, I think about how might this information be useful to a researcher in the future, which is great. It's a sensible way of making decisions, but it also has the effect of discounting the possibility that those transcribers might themselves become researchers in the future. So I think you need to allow people space to experiment without being too concerned about the boundaries of the project, without kind of reining people in on the boundaries of the project all the time. So when I asked whether citizen history projects are really helping people become historians, some clearly are, but some aren't. And I think one reason is, as a computer person, I think about it as being a clash in the namespaces. So there's different models of what citizen history could be. And I think citizen history, in drawing on citizen science, which has roots both in crowdsourcing and in public participation in science research, which had a really explicit educational goal and a kind of goal to give people agency to do with the local environment. I think some people are using the term citizen history when they really mean crowdsourcing, and they're not intending to inherit this history of the kind of educational process, or the process of helping people become historians. So we see these grassroots projects, like FreeBMD, the online parish clerks is another one. There are many research projects by local historians that are, they get together in the village hall or pub and they organise these projects and they go away and they do them, they come back and they report. They might involve academics, and often there's a really interesting relationship between the historian and the next village over who they'll go and talk to for advice. But they don't ask for a historian to lead the project. They lead the project themselves. You get these accidentally citizen history projects like Old Weather, which was the combination of interesting material, an active forum that provided opportunities to discuss things, to ask questions, and the encouragement of maritime historians and people who were excited themselves to bring their historical skills to bear on new material. Led to historical research projects, led to people becoming citizen historians. You've got these explicitly educational citizen history projects, like the Children of the Lord's Ghetto. It was carefully designed to guide participants through the process of finding reliable evidence, thinking about historical thinking, to learn what's required at different stages of the task. But then you've got this kind of use of citizen history as a marketing term. I've been working in crowdsourcing for a number of years now, and recently I've heard that it's not sexy enough to get grant money anymore. So I think some people are moving on to saying, well, it's a citizen history project because they know that crowdsourcing is a harder sell. And I think sometimes people just get excited because it's a new buzzword and everyone likes to work on buzzwords. But I think the saddest of them all is this kind of accidentally not quite citizen history project. So it's people that wanted to be citizen history projects but didn't quite make it, or didn't manage to reach that goal to a really significant extent. It could be because they failed to reach or to retain a critical mass of participants, but perhaps more often it's because the project didn't provide the support necessary. So some of these projects that claim to be working with citizen historians are really just working with citizen transcribers. It might not have been their intention, but that's effectively what's happening. So why does this happen? What are the structural issues that underlie some of these failures? And here I'm assuming that many projects start on the path of citizen history in good faith. They're not intentionally overselling the experience. At a really basic level, copyright, which I think is probably obligatory to mention in a digital history seminar. So things like unpublished manuscripts, the commercialization of resources can each hamper the ability of a project to provide access to the source materials. Citizen science projects are normally really big on providing access to the materials. You helped create the data, so you should have access to it. If you don't have access to it, it makes it difficult to do things like collect interesting examples of something happening in a unit war diary. But we see when people are able to do these things, that interesting projects result. I think a lot of organisations are still more comfortable with broadcast than with dialogue. It's partly logistical. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources to really engage in conversation with the public. I think it's also partly cultural. So the challenges of shared authority aren't for everyone. Some people just aren't going to step up to them. And there's no getting around the fact that engaging in community discussion is resource intensive. I think sometimes research students might be ideally placed to do this because it's a great form of constructive procrastination. It's a chance to deepen your own skills and indulge your passion for the subject. Some people enjoy community discussion and they might welcome the opportunity to spend a coffee break looking over a forum. But context also matters. The same person who might happily chat to Facebook friends in their coffee break would find it a chore if they were asked to engage with strangers and very gently explain the nuances of historical thinking. Even if it's on the same platform, it's a different task. But I think also not everyone has the skills to provide the right kind of encouragement at the right moment. And I think universities are grappling with this with MOOCs because the rise in distance education means skills are needed in communicating online. You need to be able to turn participant mistakes into learning opportunities. And you see some of these projects outsourcing community management to volunteers. Sometimes that works really well, but sometimes you only need to look at the Wikipedia talk page for any article to realise that not everyone who is interested in sharing their knowledge is an empathic and constructive communicator online. Sometimes projects are all set to do the right thing. They've got resources on board, but they just don't get a critical mass of people keen to engage in conversation about the material. Sometimes the material doesn't have those hooks that let people find out more, or people might not be interested in the underlying discipline and more interested in the material in other ways. It also takes a lot of time to monitor discussions, to spot those interesting questions, those serendipitous discoveries, accidental project reference. And even the Zooniverse has tried different ways to get significant questions or items to kind of bubble up from the massive discussion. But it's a difficult problem to solve. And we see projects that don't have historians on staff might rely on academic historians to answer questions. Those academics might have the best of intentions, but between teaching, research, administration, grant writing, it's hard to find time to sit and look at a forum. Many of the historians who showed up when Operation War Diary first started haven't posted in the months since then. So there was a big flurry of interest at the start and then they've kind of disappeared. One or two have posted once or twice in February or March. So sometimes projects overpromise the levels of expert participation and they just can't deliver it. Even when historians are paying attention to the resources or the results of a project, if there's no visible sign of that attention in the forum discussion where the community can see it, it's effectively invisible. And I think this inattention signals to a project that participant discussions aren't as valued as the mechanical tasks that they're undertaking. I think some historians don't realise the extent to which their training and skills give them tacit knowledge and a lot of experience. They might not realise that the things that they take for granted would actually be hugely valuable to other people who just need the occasional nudge in terms of knowing where to look for sources or knowing how to interpret sources or how to get unstuck with things. And I think finally there's an inherent tension between the desire for productivity and the desire to support communities of practice. Supporting nascent historians through community discussion means finding resources. It means recognising expertise, encouraging moderators. And the time that participants are spending discussing interesting things on forums means they're not spending time undertaking the core task of a project. And I think for projects that are using crowdsourcing to fill gaps in funding, or they're using crowdsourcing because they can get a crowdsourcing project funded but they couldn't get a digitalisation project funded, they have a concern about getting the most done in a project while they've still got funding. So anything that takes away from the core task is a less attractive proposition. I wanted to think about the effect that this all has. This is the tweet that kind of originally set me off on this path of really asking what's going on with citizen whatever. I should point out this project was not written by, this tweet wasn't written by someone in the project, it was written by someone who writes the software that the project used. They were just excited. They didn't intend to kind of trigger this thing. I spent 5 years working in archaeology. I would never call myself an archaeologist because I've never trained as an archaeologist. So transcribing text might be something that an archaeologist would do, but it doesn't make you an archaeologist. Transcribing text is something a historian does, but it doesn't make you a historian. I think calling people who've transcribed a few lines of text citizen historians undermines the time and effort that others have put into becoming historians, even though they've done it outside of formal education or outside of professional employment. It has the effect of flattening expertise. If you become a citizen historian after transcribing a few lines of text, then what are you called after you've spent 5 years researching the history of surfaces? And I think there's a concern that citizen historian will come to mean faux historian, and that we won't have any language to talk about participants who are learning to think historically, or participants who have learned to think historically, or who have learned to become historians through participation. And I think it also kind of oversells the excitement levels. It's not, transcribing text is nothing like being Indiana Jones. Not that archaeology is like being Indiana Jones. But I saw one, it was an NEH funding document that talked about developing a transcription tool for the Coptic language. They were going to engage citizen scholars who were going to help tell the story of early Christian life from Egyptian papyrus documents. I don't see how providing access to the tasks is supporting the development of citizen scholars. If you can't read the text, let alone interpret it, I just don't see. And perhaps they had an explicit plan for helping people learn to read papyri, but I'm not sure that they did. So I think perhaps we need to be more honest sometimes and say citizen transcribers, learn an ancient language by transcribing text without promising that you'll somehow be a scholar of early Christianity. We need better language to distinguish citizen history and citizen historians. So you can do the work that is like the work that historians do, but it doesn't mean you're doing the work of a historian. So I think that we should hold projects to a higher standard in the language that they use. To my mind, citizen historian should be approaching an equivalence with avocational or amateur historians, some of whom are highly skilled, they have years of experience, some are less so, but they're often still judged on whether they produce good history or not. And if we can't even judge citizen historians on their relationship to their historical skills, then I think that's problematic. And I think we're undermining the skills and experience of those who are getting more advanced. So I think that promising that transcribers can become citizen historians without supporting the process is overselling the experience, and it could reduce the ability of projects to actually recruit historians or recruit participants. And the emerging field of citizen scholarship or learning through participation could suffer. I think that there's a risk that citizen becomes a euphemism for wannabe or enthusiast. There is some material produced by journalists that really is equating citizen historian with armchair historian. A kind of admirer of popular history rather than a participant in the process of creating history or thinking about history. And research into motivations for participating show that learning and mastering skills is really important, as is following a pre-existing interest. So if we're promising that and not supporting it, I think it's raising ethical issues. And I think as my final point, it's really striking that the term citizen historian is often invoked when an organisation wishes to harness the work of volunteers to meet the goals of a project. They don't talk about their relationships with other communities of amateur historians in the same ways. So citizen as a term is coming to mean workforce in some way. But then again, if we hold citizen history projects to higher standards, does it mean that they're out of the reach of all but the most well-funded projects or those with the most engaged communities of participants? And I think saying, citizen archaeologist will attract people who wouldn't call themselves volunteers, who would never think of themselves as being a volunteer transcriber. So there is some value in thinking about the glamour that these terms offer. But I think ultimately we need to provide value and rewards for participants. So I think citizen history must allow people to develop skills beyond the technical skills required for transcription. As a room full of historians, I'd be curious to know what you think exactly those skills should be, thinking back to the different models of what a historian is, what historical thinking is, and also relating them to what we expect from local and family historians. I think agency is important, I think shared authority is important, and you see that in grassroots or sort of self-organised projects, less so in institutional projects. So perhaps how do institutional projects need to open up to new forms of, or new relationships with participants? Citizen history is clearly a field that's changing rapidly, but I think for the sake of participants, whether they're transcribers or citizen historians or expert historians, we should expect institutions to take more care when selecting labels. They shouldn't carelessly, accidentally promise a learning experience in historical discipline when what they really mean is come and help transcribe text. There's no magic in this. It takes resources, it takes attention to detail, it takes caring about what happens. So I think the term citizen history should be used with an awareness of the promises that it makes to the public. Thank you.